Today our first speaker is Hugh David Joselit, a distinguished professor. He's an art historian, critic, educator and curator currently at the Graduate Center at the City University of New York, but has also previously been for a decade in the Department of Art History at Yale University. In his first book, which I should highly recommend, Infinite Regress, Marcel Duchamp, 1910 to 1941, which was drawn from his dissertation at Harvard and published by the MIT Press in 1988, Professor Joselit reveals that his long-standing engagement with Duchamp began during his curatorial work at the Institute of Contemporary Art in Boston in the 1980s. In this still relevant and intriguing book, Joselit challenges the then conventionally narrow-sighted and what he called spotlight investigations of its selected themes or works from Duchamp's oeuvre, and instead takes the reader on a journey which takes into account the plurality of identities and strategies within Duchamp's art in the years from 1910 to 1941. Applying a complex theoretical framework which combines semiotics, Marxism and psychoanalysis, he approaches Duchamp both as an author and a discursive field through careful close readings of The Last Glass and many of Duchamp's then lesser-known paintings and ready-mades, thus supplying the reader with what Yves Lenoir has described as, and what still remains, a remarkable original guide to the labyrinth of Duchamp's oeuvre. And I'm sure some of you also know Joselit's scholarship from his regular contributions to Art Forum, has encountered him as an editor of the journal October, or might have read some of his numerous books, from which, as I mentioned, only two, American Art Since 1945, which supplies a solid framework for examining and understanding the art created between 1945 and 2000, or you might have read his After Art from 2012, in which he analyzes how art and architecture has been radically transformed in the age of over. Thus, Professor Joselit joins us not only as an astute expert on Duchamp, but also as an accomplished scholar on the art and architecture of the 20th and 21st centuries. Hence, I can absolutely think of no better way of beginning this morning than listening to his lecture called The Parity of Knowledge, in which he will consider the most recent phase of the ready-made in terms of his history long century. Therefore, it is with great pleasure and special excitement that I ask you to help me welcome David Joselit.
Thank you for that very nice and generous introduction, and thanks, Jacob, for the introduction, for the invitation. Let's see, something's on the screen here. Okay. So, yes, I will be thinking about a longer genealogy of the Readymades today. Readymades operate simultaneously as appropriations of property and generators of knowledge. On account of this duality, they afford a highly efficacious device for exploring post-industrial knowledge economies, which are in the process of eclipsing manufacturing or extractive economies globally. Whether that process is concluded or not, it's the aspirational goal. Its contemporary relevance notwithstanding, however, this duality between property and knowledge was of course present in the ready-made from the start, which is why I'm showing you this diagram. In Duchamp's Fountain, which is much at issue yesterday, the property dimension is often stressed by commentators. The artist's choice is identical with his or perhaps someone else's purchase of the ready-made as property and the reassignment of its ownership or authorship to Armat or Duchamp. This shift remains within the terms of property, though, but it shifts from the urinal, from a lumpen commodity, to an aesthetic form of intellectual property. Copyright, let's say. On the other hand, if knowledge is understood as the imposition of a stable categorization onto a thing, in other words, we know something by labeling it, by attaching a meaning to it, which of course is a debatable and simplistic definition, but let's leave it for now, then the ready-made also suspends the relationship between knowledge and property at a different order of magnitude by superimposing two ostensibly irreconcilable statuses, for instance, urinal and sculpture, on the same material object. Instead of carrying a singular meaning then, the ready-made configures several simultaneous and contradictory claims on meaning. And in my current work on globalization, I'm very interested, as I think you'll see in the examples I bring up in a moment, on the ready-made as a kind of configuration of claims, as opposed to a kind of displacement of meaning on the one hand, or a status from property to knowledge on the other, although those two operations are essential to the ready-made becoming a kind of host for a configuration of different claims making. We might say that the fixity of property is undone by the proliferation of cognitive properties, a plural, attached to the singular commodity. The true form of the ready-made, then, as I just suggested, is thus not the object chosen, which, as Duchamp already said, was not the most important thing, but rather the virtual configuration of epistemological claims it generates: property, knowledge, urinal, sculpture. And here, because of my limited capacities on PowerPoint and perhaps visual imagination, it would be much better to not have a crossing axes here, but rather a kind of configuration or a figural image of how these different dimensions are projected onto or hosted by a ready-made object. So Duchamp's suspension of the urinal's meaning in Fountain belongs to a European avant-garde tradition of perpetual revolution or revision in the definition of artworks. And this came up a bit yesterday. And here I just, by way of, in some ways a nod to Thierry, and just as a kind of example of another suspension of meaning within the European avant-garde, Rodchenko's pure red, pure yellow, pure blue, the monochrome painting being a kind of strategy, let's say, adjacent to that of the ready-made, to suspend the meaning of art in a certain kind of way. In fact, we might describe the fundamental avant-garde gesture as a suspension of meaning whose effects are much more powerful than any mere formal innovation. The formal innovation is in the service of suspending meaning, perhaps. But the conditions under which the ready-made operates have changed significantly since the early 20th century. With the rise of global contemporary art, the cognitive contradictions articulated around the ready-made shift from the limited, even provincial debates regarding the definition of modern European and American artworks to a geopolitical realm characterized by conflicts between cultures and contradictory models of modernity with their own epistemological basis. So I would argue that the global problem is projected into a kind of not just suspension of meaning, but a kind of conflict of different cultural epistemologies. In the paintings of the Chinese artist Wang Ganyi, for instance, such as Great Castigation series, Coca-Cola of 1993, a socialist realist representation of Chinese workers can function simultaneously as an icon of the communist revolution or as a commercialized token of that lost historic period, both for Chinese viewers and international audiences, for whom European and Americans, let's say, communist kitsch has its own value, somewhat like the commodity Coca-Cola, which Wang has juxtaposed to them. Such works open a field of competing local and global claims over appropriated content that moves well beyond the precincts of European modernism to a negotiation between alternative models of modernity. On the one hand, we have here the model of Mao's Cultural Revolution as a kind of mass cultural modernity, in short, we could discuss, versus the modernity of Coke as a kind of consumer revolution. So two models of revolution here are, one could say, ironically juxtaposed, but also juxtaposed in the sense that the claims are reversible, that one could argue that Mao used the same strategies of celebrity and mass distribution as Coca-Cola. In order to describe these broad In order to describe these broad global strategies adequately, I believe it's necessary to sketch a genealogy of how the ready-made and later appropriation, and some of you may not like the fact, but it is a fact in this talk that I'm to some degree attaching together appropriation and the ready-made, and sometimes I'm afraid probably eliding them, but we can discuss that. For me that's not so problematic, but for some of you it might be. Anyway, so I want to sketch a genealogy of how the ready-made and later appropriation functioned since Duchamp coined the term more than 100 years ago. First, on account of its current ubiquity, I will contend that the ready-made practice should be understood as a kind of flexible technology rather than a punctual set, a punctual rupture, as historical ready-mades such as Fountain are often understood. The closest modern analogy is therefore photography, which since its invention in 1839 has assumed a multiplicity of roles vis-a-vis traditional art media. And here is a 30-second history of photography. Photography was positioned initially, of course, in some eyes, as a challenge to the media that preceded it, i.e. it would make creating painterly portraits obsolete, as in the rise in celebrity of photo portraitists like Nadar. Especially in its superior mimetic capacities, it was competitive with painting, or felt to be. Photography also functioned at a different era as an alternative to the fine arts through its documentary and commercial manifestations, such as here USSR and construction, but we could look at Western magazines in Europe and the US, such as Life magazine. Of course, later in the 60s and especially the 70s, photography became a fine art medium in its own right, and here I'm just putting a Dion Arbus photograph to stand in for that. And finally, in our own moment, digital photography is a generalized tool that has become something that virtually every artist uses. And here I'm showing you a website presentation of Jim Welling's work, who doesn't, as far as I know, really use digital photography, but his work is staged within a kind of art world that is completely digitized. So the status of photography has changed vis-a-vis art in complex, multiplex ways. Similarly, understood as a technology, the ready-made and appropriation have shifted in their function while becoming as common as photography as a tool in global contemporary art, in my view. I would argue that the ready-made strategy and appropriation are almost as ubiquitous as photography, which obviously gives us a certain kind of interpretive challenge, because we're not talking about a punctual rupture like the one made by Fountain in 1917. I will propose 3 dimensions of ready-made practice, tracing them through the Euro-American canon in anticipation of their widespread globalization in the 90s. They include the ready-made's ontological challenge to artworks through its equation of commodity and art object, its semantic deployment of ready-mades as lexical elements, usually ideological, within artworks, and a third cultural dimension, which most directly encompasses the global, wherein appropriated objects and images generate a pattern of claims and counterclaims on the meaning of cultural property. In actuality, as has been apparent, I hope, in my discussion of Fountain, as brief as it was, all of these dimensions are present in the ready-made from the beginning, and I think that I don't have to belabor this because the rich talks about Fountain yesterday made it clear that each of these dimensions, the ontological, the semantic, and the cultural, were present already in Duchamp's ready-made. So I want to underline the fact that I recognize that, but what I'm arguing instead is that the dimension that dominates, that becomes more important, shifts over time. So in the course of its century-long history, the ready-made has established varying ratios, I would argue, between knowledge and property. And that's what I want to just sort of sketch out very briefly in the time that remains. Thierry Duduc has influentially argued that in equating artworks with commodities, Duchamp's ready-mades provoke a shift from the conventional aesthetic question, is it beautiful, to an ontological challenge: is it art? The Readymade suggests that anything may function as an artwork if, for instance, an artist chose it, or a gallery or museum chooses to exhibit it, or chooses not to exhibit it, as we discussed at great length yesterday, as long as it gets on the record, as Thierry has argued. While such a fundamental rethinking of art's definition has an enormous historical and philosophical legacy, its actual disruptive force quickly wanes after the initial shock. In other words, a shock effect can't be sustained over 100 years. By now, most participants in the art world, including large sections of the general public, have adopted a very broad definition of artworks, which fully accepts appropriated content as legitimate. I don't know of any story of people being outraged by Readymades in recent years, but the disruptive moment is only the first step in the Readymades operations. And much of this came up yesterday, but I want to place a sort of slightly different emphasis here. While the controversy surrounding Fountain did, of course, begin with a refusal by the jury of the New York Independents in 1917 to ratify the work of art, in the face of this refusal, as we saw, and as well known, Duchamp countered Fountain's failed application and subsequent physical disappearance with a sustained publicity effort, spanning decades, whose purpose was to keep the work alive through gossip, publication, reenactment, and refabrication. Here are just two examples, but I mentioned yesterday the Schwartz reissues, which occurred near the end of Duchamp's life. So it really was a kind of lifelong project of sustaining the Readymades' life, not as an object, but as discourse, as knowledge. Given the fact that this work is now an icon of modern art, and we heard numbers yesterday, statistics, such efforts must be considered a brilliant success. I mean, what one could say is that Duchamp is the artist who figured out you could make the greatest icon of modern art without actually making anything, and not even having the thing anymore. Duchamp's Readymades thus explore two sides of modern art's ontological condition, both as property and as knowledge. And this is where my argument might add a slightly different dimension, which is that the property side is no more important than the lesson about knowledge, that the work of art must exist within knowledge, which perhaps is different from saying the work of art has become conceptual. Again, that could be discussed if you want to. In other words, the standard account of the Readymade as a form of negation accomplished by equating an art object with an ordinary commodity, and I don't mean among people in this room necessarily, but certainly in the world when one's teaching, is only the first step in its operations, which in a subsequent moment calls forth a profuse spectacularization of the work in order to keep its image alive, or as Duduve has it, to put it on the record in the realm of knowledge. It is this latter dynamic of publicity or discourse that opens onto the second semantic meaning of the Readymade, in which commodities function as the ideologically rich language of consumer society. Robert Rauschenberg's rebus is, a kind of obvious choice here because of its name. It signals this idea of a kind of lexical, semantic relation with the Readymade in its title. For a rebus is a sentence composed of pictures or objects. In this case, Readymade pictures drawn from various print sources. While such a grammar of appropriated elements was already present in the work of an artist such as Hannah Hoch, pioneering photomontages from 1919 onward, as well as Merritt Oppenheim or Salvador Dali's surrealist objects of the mid-1930s, with the differences we're aware of. It was but I would argue that already they're introducing a semantic dimension as opposed to an ontological one, which is why these works, why it's the Fountain that has become so famous, and not some things like these. It was at the mid-century, and especially in pop art, that a strategy incorporating or reproducing commercial objects as potent symbols, as opposed to merely generic commodities or lexical elements, became widespread. Of course, in Andy Warhol's work, the Campbell's soup can or Coca-Cola bottle function as emblems of American Cold War economic power, not just as commodities, possessing and even flaunting qualities of consumer abundance through their repetition. In other words, their value as knowledge, or perhaps we could say as ideology, significantly overshadows their value and their affective presence as property. Notice that we are seeing labels, not objects, and even when he makes objects, there are silkscreen labels around them, such as the Brillo pens. Warhol himself gave a brilliant and deadpan retrospective account of Koch's supposed egalitarianism, its kind of American ideology. Many of you probably know this, but I love this passage, so I like to read it. Warhol from A to B and Back Again, I'm misquoting the title. Anyway, what's great about this country is that America started the tradition where the richest consumers buy essentially the same things as the poorest. You can be watching TV and see Coca-Cola, and you can know that the president drinks Coke, Liz Taylor drinks Coke, and just think you can drink Coke too. A Coke is a Coke, and no amount of money can get you a better Coke than the one the bum on the corner is drinking. So there's a whole kind of, this is a kind of subversion of the egalitarian kind of proposal of commodity democracy or brand democracy that Coke promises. But the same Coca-Cola that Warhol celebrates for its ideology of egalitarianism from an American perspective was recognized and critiqued as an imperialist ideology by Brazilian artist Ciro Morales, as well as other pop artists from Latin America. In his insertion into ideological circuits in 1970, and I'm sorry I don't have a slide that has this particular phrase on it, but this gives you a sense of how he made the work. Morales transferred brief messages regarding political arrests or disappearances under the Brazilian dictatorship, as well as the slogan, "Yankees go home," onto Coke bottles in the process of being recycled back into circulation through the prevailing deposit system in Brazil and other parts of the world, where the used bottles were cleaned and refilled with the drink and put back into circulation. Because Morales' texts were inserted as though they were part of the bottle's packaging, in other words, they were not announced as art, they were encountered outside of art institutions by unsuspecting consumers seeking no more than to enjoy a bottle of Coke. The bum on the street, the president, etc., but in the Brazilian context. Thus, while Duchamp's Readymades came into being by entering into the institutions of art, Morales has found an audience by returning to the circuits of ordinary commodities, which may or may not have been a very successful strategy, let's face it. But what it does make clear is that the Coke bottle is simultaneously an advertisement for an American commercial dominance and a political representation of these US policies in Brazil and Latin America more broadly that abetted the repressive dictatorships there, which was very present in pop art of the period in the region. A diagram of geopolitical power thus intersects and interferes with the circulation of a global brand. This is the kind of projection onto the ready-made that I was discussing earlier as a configuration of claims. Ideology, which after all is a form of knowledge, engulfs property. Such questions of cultural property emerge in a different, more global fashion in the 1980s debates around appropriation in Australia, for instance, which exemplify the third or global stage of the ready-made and appropriation. These complex debates were contentiously intercultural, arising from the encounter of different models of Aboriginal and Euro-Australian knowledge, as well as differential positioning between a self-consciously provincial Australia, self-theorized as provincial vis-a-vis the Anglo-European world, and European or American art centers. We can identify three broad positions. So this is a very kind of complex field of different claims and counterclaims, and I'm just going to organize it quite schematically into three moments or scenes of appropriation. The first is that Aboriginal artists appropriate their own heritage. So this is a kind of self-appropriation in a certain way. The inalienable rights of Aboriginal people to their ceremonial totems, to which individual people can claim access through their lifetimes through inheritance and other lines of transmission, were made alienable and sold in the form of Aboriginal acrylic dot painting that emerged in the 1970s. In this work, sacred signs or configurations that should be accessible only to initiates were amended to allow them to enter Anglo-Australian or global art markets. So it's important to understand that these appropriations were knowing, because secret or sacred information that should not be seen by Anglos was not put into these works. That's why I think many in this debate have claimed that it is a kind of self-appropriation. Once in circulation there, the abstraction of these paintings made them vulnerable to appropriation by Western aesthetic discourses, of course, as a form of abstraction. Probably all of us have seen these paintings in large exhibitions internationally. The second scene of appropriation is the nation appropriates Aboriginal culture. And here I could elaborate this further, but basically what we're seeing on this slide is the Aboriginal art athlete Kathy Freeman, who became a symbol of the 2000 Olympics in Sydney, that also was full of different artistic expressions, including Aboriginal materials by Aboriginal makers. Later on, through this period and into the late teens, I think this has stopped now, Qantas Airlines used Aboriginal patterns in their planes, and also you can see in the flight attendants' uniforms. So Anglo-Australia appropriated Aboriginal, I mean, it's probably needless to say, but as in my own country in the United States, where Native Americans were basically segregated on reservations and economically exploited, and this was very much the case with Aboriginals as well. However, they emerge as a kind of symbol of Australian multiculturalism. And then finally, here's something that I think is extremely interesting, really, which is a self-conscious appropriation among Anglo-Australian artists of both European and Aboriginal material. The most famous of these is Imants Tillers, who in the work I'm showing you here, the 9 shots, superimposes an image of Georg Joselit and the Aboriginal artist Michael Giacomarra in a kind of modular painting where it's almost pixelated, where each of these different artists are brought together. There's an interesting set of debates in Australia about how Australia is itself, in its Anglo culture, a kind of appropriation of the West, a kind of Western appropriation of the West. As the cultural critic Megan Morris has expressed it, the modern in Australia has only marginally been understood as entailing the future, youth, originality, innovation, rupture, the unknown, and so forth. The modern has much more commonly been understood as a known history, something that has already happened elsewhere, and which is to be reproduced mechanically or otherwise with a local content. So the Australian example for me is important as a global paradigm because it demonstrates 2 forms of self-appropriation by indigenous artists and Euro artists, and also public or official national appropriation of both for a kind of multicultural agenda. So I've argued that in the ontological dimension, ready-mades generate new knowledge by suspending conventional meanings. In the semantic dimension, commodified material functions ideologically, where each ready-made has its own kind of lexical meaning, and they are put together as rebuses, let's say. And finally, in the cultural dimension, the ready-made may stage contradictory claims regarding community property. Who owns this? It's not even who owns it, but who has the right to deploy it. These are very complex. As you can see, each one of these examples in Australia has multiple contradictory claims on them. As a malleable practice that is analogous to photography, the ready-made has remained a compelling aesthetic tactic throughout the 20th and 21st century, precisely because it can manifest the different relations that knowledge establishes with and as property. The ready-made, it seems, is the work of art in the age of the post-industrial, in the age of post-industrial production. Thank you very much.